We enter this story carrying an assumption so familiar that it rarely feels like an assumption at all. The idea that the modern world represents the first moment in which humanity truly understands the planet it lives on, that only with satellites, supercomputers, and global data networks have we finally begun to see how Earth really works. But what if this confidence is misplaced? What if we are not the first to ask these questions, but merely the latest to arrive at a story that began long before history was written? To explore that possibility, we have to step back not by decades or centuries, but by tens of thousands of years, far enough that the landmarks of modern civilization lose their meaning. Far enough that nations' borders and technologies dissolve into a brief flicker in deep time. From that distance, Earth does not move to the rhythm of human lives. It moves to slower, colder, and far more patient cycles. Cycles that unfold over spans so long that a single lifetime cannot fully register them, yet powerful. Enough to decide the fate of entire cultures. Today we describe these patterns with precise language: orbital cycles, climate oscillations, magnetic reversals, solar rhythms, and lunar tides. The words sound neutral, even detached, but for most of human existence, these forces were not abstractions. They were experienced directly through failed harvests, advancing ice, retreating shorelines, and skies that no longer behaved as memory said they should. And what stands out is not that ancient people misunderstood these changes, but that many societies appear to have organized their lives around anticipating them. Imagine a world without electricity, without global trade, without vast reserves of stored food. In such a world, environmental stability is not a convenience. It is survival when the climate shifts. Collapse is not theoretical. It is immediate under those conditions. Watching the sky is not ritual, it is strategy. Remembering patterns of wind, water, and heat is not myth. Making it is an archive passed from one generation to the next, encoded in stories, symbols, and monuments, durable enough to outlast individual lives. Before we go any further, if you feel like it, let me know in the comments how you're listening right now. Some people are winding down for sleep, some are resting, some are just letting the story play in the background. I always find it interesting how these ideas meet people in different moments. And just as a quiet note, the images you see here are meant only to add atmosphere and context. The story stands even without them. Thank you, as always, for being here and for supporting this journey. This raises an unsettling possibility. What if many of the myths we dismiss today are not inventions, but compressed memories of cycles too long for a single human lifespan to witness in full? What if tales of golden ages, great floods, eternal winters, and burning skies were not fantasies, but narrative tools designed to preserve information when writing was rare and fragile? If so, then ancient civilizations may not have lived in ignorance of Earth's rhythms, but in constant negotiation with them. What makes this idea uncomfortable is what it implies about us. If civilizations before ours understood these cycles and still collapsed, then knowledge alone was never enough if they aligned their societies with the rhythms of the planet and were still overwhelmed. Then what exactly protects us today? Our technology gives us reach and speed, but it does not grant immunity from forces that operate on planetary timescales. Modern history is often told as a straight line from primitive to advanced, from confusion to clarity, from vulnerability to control. Yet Earth does not move in straight lines. It moves in loops, cycles that overlap, reinforce, and sometimes collide, reaching moments where balance gives way and systems reset. Civilizations in this view are not permanent achievements, but temporary arrangements that exist during calmer intervals between far larger rhythms. One of the quieter realizations emerging from modern science is that the most significant planetary changes rarely arrive without warning. They announce themselves slowly through small deviations, subtle shifts, signals too weak to dominate a single lifetime, but unmistakable when viewed across millennia, if Ancient societies track these signs, then they may have understood something that is difficult for us to feel today, the scale of time itself. Perhaps their central question was never how to conquer nature, but how to remain in step with it for as long as possible. That difference matters, because one path leads to expansion without limits, while the other leads to self-imposed restraint, and history suggests that societies built on restraint leave fewer obvious monuments. They leave gaps, silences, and unanswered questions. It is within those gaps that we now stand, surrounded by data technology and a powerful sense of control, yet increasingly disconnected from the long rhythms of the planet beneath us. We can forecast tomorrow's weather with astonishing accuracy, but struggle to hold the next 1,000 years in view. We respond rapidly to short-term crises while remaining uncertain about the slow converging cycles that shape the deeper future. This story does not argue that ancient civilizations possessed perfect answers, nor does it romanticize the past. Instead, it asks whether a way of seeing the world once existed that placed cycles rather than stability at the center, a perspective that may have been lost when humanity began to believe it had escaped the most basic constraints of the planet. If that perspective once guided human societies, then the question is no longer whether we understand Earth's cycles, but whether we are listening to them in the right way, because it is possible that earlier civilizations did not disappear because they were ignorant, but because even awareness could not always overcome the moment when multiple cycles aligned. If that is true, then we are not standing at the beginning of this story, but somewhere near the end of a familiar loop, where old signals are returning in new forms, where patterns long forgotten are quietly reasserting themselves in a world far more crowded and fragile than before. From here we will not begin with data or disaster, but with the sky itself, the first clock humanity ever learned to read, a place where ancient observers measured time not in hours, but in returns, in alignments, and in the slow, unstoppable rhythms of Earth, because it was there that the earliest understanding of cycles began, and it is there that the deeper story of rise, collapse, and forgetting truly starts. Long before stone cities rose from riverbanks, and long before writing fixed human memory into clay and ink, the sky was already keeping time. Not time in the sense of hours and minutes, but time as rhythm and return as pattern, and warning as repetition stretched across generations. Every day the sun rose and fell. Every month the moon changed its face. Every year shadows shifted their length and direction across the ground. These movements were not subtle, and they were not random. They repeated with a reliability that made them the first stable reference system humanity ever encountered. For people living close to the edge of survival, the sky was not scenery. It was information. It told them when floods would come and when drought would linger. It told them when animals would migrate and when plants would flower. It told them when heat would dominate and when cold would return. Over time, these observations accumulated not as isolated facts, but as structured knowledge passed down through careful watching and long memory. This is where the idea of the sky as a clock begins to emerge, not as metaphor, but as function. A clock does not explain why time passes. It simply reveals that it does. In the same way, ancient skywatching did not require an understanding of physics or orbital mechanics. It required attention. It required patience. And it required the recognition that certain alignments always preceded certain outcomes. Across the ancient world, structures began to appear that were clearly designed with this understanding in mind. Stone circles whose openings framed the sunrise on a single day of the year. Temples whose corridors flooded with light only at solstice or equinox. Pyramids and platforms aligned not with mountains or rivers, but with stars that rose and set on predictable paths. These were not decorative choices. They were calibrations. When a society commits vast labor and resources to orient its most sacred spaces towards celestial events, it is making a statement about what it values and what it fears. The sky was not distant. It was authoritative. It governed the rhythms of life below. In Mesopotamia, the earliest written records are filled not only with economic transactions and laws, but with meticulous observations of the heavens. Clay tablets recorded the movements of planets, and the timing of eclipses across centuries. These records were not kept by isolated mystics, but by institutional priest astronomers, whose role was to advise rulers on matters of timing and risk. Plant too early, and the harvest fails. Wage war under the wrong sky, and disaster follows. Delay construction, and the river floods before the walls are complete. This was not superstition in the casual sense. It was pattern recognition built on accumulated experience. A society that survives long enough begins to notice that the environment behaves differently at different times, and that those differences are often preceded by signs above. In Egypt, the annual flooding of the Nile was not treated as a surprise, but as a scheduled event linked to the heliacal rising of specific stars. The return of Sirius to the dawn sky marked the coming of the waters with such reliability that it became the backbone of their calendar. This was not guesswork. It was correlation refined into confidence. Far across the ocean in the Americas, the Maya developed calendrical systems so intricate that they tracked not only the solar year, but multiple overlapping cycles, including those of Venus and the Moon. Their inscriptions do not merely count days. They encode relationships between celestial cycles and earthly events. Certain periods were considered favorable, others dangerous. The difference was not symbolic, it was practical. What becomes clear when these cultures are viewed together is that skywatching was not an isolated curiosity, but a shared strategy. Different environments produced different emphases, but the underlying principle remained the same. The sky was stable enough to trust and complex enough to contain warnings. The deeper implication is unsettling. If ancient civilizations invested so heavily in tracking celestial cycles, then the stakes must have been high. These systems were not built to satisfy curiosity. They were built because something depended on getting the timing right. This is where modern perspectives often misinterpret the evidence. When we encounter ancient sky-aligned architecture, we tend to separate the scientific from the symbolic, as though the two could not coexist. Either these people were precise observers, or they were religious dreamers. In reality, those roles were inseparable. Meaning and measurement reinforced one another because both were anchored in survival. A flood myth is not a weather report, but it is not fiction either. It is memory shaped to endure. It compresses experience into story so that it can survive long after the original observers are gone. The sky clock does the same thing in a different language. One uses narrative, the other uses stone and shadow. Over generations, knowledge like this becomes vulnerable. If conditions remain stable long enough, the original reasons for vigilance begin to fade. Calendars continue to be used, but their urgency diminishes. Rituals remain, but their purpose becomes symbolic rather than strategic. What was once preparation becomes tradition. What was once warning becomes ceremony. And then the sky keeps moving. The cycles do not stop because they have been forgotten. The Earth does not pause because its rhythms are no longer understood. It continues its long motion through space-tracing arcs and angles that remain indifferent to belief. When conditions shift again, the old markers may no longer be watched, and the old knowledge may no longer be available in a form that can be acted upon. This is how a clock can keep perfect time while no one is listening. The idea that ancient civilizations oriented themselves around the sky does not require them to have known everything. They did not need to understand axial precession or orbital eccentricity to recognize that patterns existed beyond the span of a single lifetime. They needed only to notice that the sky repeated itself while the ground below sometimes changed catastrophically. What we are left with today are fragments, alignments without instructions, calendars without context, myths without timelines. They appear impressive but disconnected. Yet when viewed through the lens of Earth cycles, they begin to resemble the remains of an older interface between humanity and the planet it inhabits. If the sky was once a clock, then it was also a warning system. And like any warning system, it only works if it is maintained and interpreted correctly. When that interpretation fails, the clock does not break. The consequences simply arrive unannounced. The civilizations that followed may have inherited the structures, but not the urgency. They may have memorized the dates, but forgotten the reasons. Over time, the sky became beautiful again instead of dangerous, predictable again instead of threatening. That comfort would not last forever, because while daily and yearly cycles are easy to see, there are larger ones moving silently beneath them. Cycles that unfold across centuries and millennia, and that do not announce themselves with obvious signs. These deeper rhythms do not reveal themselves in a single lifetime. They require memory longer than memory itself. And when those cycles shift, they do not ask whether anyone is still watching the sky. They simply continue. There are patterns in the world that cannot be seen by watching the sky for a season or even for a lifetime. They reveal themselves only when memory stretches beyond generations, when stories persist longer than cities, and when the land itself becomes the archive. These are the deep cycles of the earth, the ones that move so slowly they feel permanent until suddenly they are not. Long before the first temple was aligned to a sunrise, ice had already begun its slow advance and retreat across the planet. Vast sheets of frozen water crept down from the poles, reshaping continents, carving valleys, and locking oceans away behind walls of white. Then just as gradually they withdrew. Sea levels rose, coastlines vanished, new lands emerged, forests replaced tundra. The earth warmed, cooled, and warmed again, not once but repeatedly. Modern science calls these rhythms Milankovitch cycles, named for the astronomer who first described how subtle changes in Earth's orbit and orientation alter the distribution of sunlight across the planet. The orbit itself slowly shifts in shape, cycling from near circular to slightly elongated over roughly 100,000 years, changing how evenly solar energy is received. At the same time, the tilt of the Earth's axis oscillates over about 41,000 years, altering the contrast between seasons. Layered on top of both is a slow wobble of the axis, a precession that completes a full cycle roughly every 26,000 years, subtly changing the timing of seasons relative to Earth's position in space. None of these movements feel dramatic on human timescales. No single generation experiences them as events, yet together they decide whether summers are strong enough to melt accumulated ice or mild enough to let it grow, whether glaciers retreat or advance, whether vast regions tilt toward abundance or scarcity for thousands of years at a time. These cycles operate far beyond the scale of recorded history, and yet their effects are written everywhere. They are locked into ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica, where layer upon layer of compacted snowfall preserves a chemical diary of the past. Tiny air bubbles trapped within that ice contain samples of ancient atmospheres, allowing scientists to reconstruct concentrations of carbon dioxide and methane stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Those records reveal repeated rises and falls in temperature that align closely with orbital cycles long before human industry existed. The memory is also written into the oceans. In deep-sea sediments lie the shells of microscopic organisms called foraminifera. These creatures built their shells from seawater, incorporating oxygen isotopes in ratios that change with temperature and ice volume. By reading those ratios, scientists can trace ancient ocean conditions across immense spans of time, confirming that warming and cooling followed persistent, repeating patterns. The land, the sea, and the air all tell the same story. But geology and chemistry are not the only places where this memory survives. Across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, there is a striking recurrence of stories that speak of a colder world, of an age when ice dominated the land, when survival required retreat, adaptation, or escape. These stories rarely describe ice sheets in scientific language. Instead, they speak of endless winters, sunless skies, and lands abandoned to cold. They mark a before and an after, a boundary between worlds. Then come the floods. As ice retreats, it does not disappear quietly. It melts. And when enough ice melts, oceans rise. Shorelines drown. Rivers change course. What was once inland becomes coastal. What was once coastal disappears beneath the sea. This transition is not sudden in geological terms, but it is catastrophic in human ones. If a civilization builds its identity around a coastline, that coastline does not need to vanish overnight to destroy it. It only needs to retreat beyond use. Salty intrusion poisons farmland. Harbours become unstable. Fresh water disappears. Trade routes collapse. People leave. Knowledge fragments. Flood myths appear again and again at precisely this boundary. They are found in Mesopotamia, South Asia, the Americas, and beyond. Different names, different gods, different heroes. But the same core memory remains. Water rises. The old world ends. A smaller remnant survives. It is tempting to interpret these stories as symbolic moral lessons, but symbolism does not explain their global distribution or their consistency. What they resemble more closely is a shared response to a shared experience repeated at different times in different places as ice ages ended and sea levels surged. What makes this unsettling is the timing. The last major ice age ended around 12,000 years ago. That same interval marks the beginning of large-scale human civilization as we recognize it today. Agriculture spreads. Permanent settlements appear. Monumental architecture begins. Writing soon follows. It is as though humanity emerged into history just after a planetary reset, stepping into a world that had only recently stabilized. This raises a question that is rarely asked directly. What existed before that reset? During the last glacial maximum sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than they are today. Vast coastal plains that would have been ideal for early settlement now lie submerged beneath shallow seas. These regions are difficult to explore and even harder to interpret, which makes them easy to dismiss. But if earlier cultures lived along those drowned coastlines, their absence from the archaeological record would be expected, not suspicious. Even inland the transition was violent. As climates shifted, ecosystems reorganized themselves. Animals migrated or vanished. Familiar food sources disappeared. Regions that had been habitable for thousands of years became marginal or hostile. Knowledge that had been tuned to old conditions lost its relevance almost overnight. This is where the idea of guidance becomes critical. If a society recognized that long cold cycles existed, even without understanding their precise mechanics, it might attempt to plan around them. It might build in places less vulnerable to flooding. It might preserve knowledge in stone rather than perishable materials. It might encode memory into myth so it could survive displacement and loss. But recognition does not guarantee survival. Milankovitch cycles do not operate in isolation. They overlap with volcanic activity, shifts in ocean circulation, changes in atmospheric composition, and occasional shocks from space. A civilization that understands the rhythm may still be overwhelmed when multiple forces converge. Knowledge can buy time. It cannot always prevent collapse. This may explain why so much ancient memory feels fragmented, why knowledge appears early, then disappears, why advanced understanding seems to flash into existence and then retreat, leaving behind only echoes. Each collapse erases not only cities but continuity. Survivors rebuild with less information than their predecessors possessed. Over generations, the deeper context fades. The Earth remembers even when we do not. Ice returns, ice retreats, seas rise, seas stabilize. The cycle continues whether or not there is anyone left who remembers what the last turning looked like. What changes is not the pattern, but the awareness of it. From this perspective, Ancient monuments aligned to the sky take on a new dimension. They are not only markers of daily and yearly cycles, but acts of defiance against forgetting, attempts to anchor memory into something more durable than oral tradition. Stone does not remember why it was placed where it was placed, but it remains long enough for someone else to ask the question again. If Earth's long cold memory once guided civilizations, then it did so imperfectly. Enough to inspire preparation, not enough to guarantee survival. And when collapse came, it likely did not feel like the failure of knowledge, but the exhaustion of it, a recognition that understanding a cycle does not grant control over it. What remains today is a world that appears stable only because we have lived within one favorable phase. We look back at ice ages as distant curiosities and floods as ancient legends, yet the forces that created them have not stopped. They have only moved beyond the range of everyday perception. The danger lies not in the cycles themselves, but in mistaking their current quiet for permanence. Because the Earth has not finished remembering its colder selves. If the sky was the first clock, then the ocean was the first archive, not because it records events neatly, but because it absorbs change and releases it on its own terms. Long after ice retreats and continents settle, the sea continues to move heat around the planet, storing memory in currents that travel thousands of kilometers and return years later altered but familiar. To ancient coastal societies, the ocean was never neutral. It was generous one decade and destructive the next. Fish arrived in abundance and then vanished without warning. Rains followed expected seasons until suddenly they did not. Storms shifted their paths. Coastlines that had felt stable for generations became unpredictable. These changes were not random, even if they felt that way to those living through them. Today we describe one of the most powerful expressions of this behavior as the El Niño Southern Oscillation, a slow pulse between ocean and atmosphere that repeats every few years. Warm water gathers where it should not. Trade winds weaken or strengthen. Rain moves from one continent to another. Regions that depend on seasonal balance are thrown into extremes of flood or drought. But this phenomenon did not begin when it was named. It has shaped human history far longer than it has shaped scientific models. Along the Pacific coasts of the Americas and Asia, entire societies oriented their lives around the reliability of marine ecosystems. Fisheries flourished when cold, nutrient-rich water rose from the depths. Crops thrived when rainfall followed familiar routes. When that system faltered, the consequences cascaded outward. Fish disappeared first, then food shortages followed, then social strain set in. In the Andes, archaeological layers reveal repeated interruptions in settlement patterns. Periods of expansion are followed by abandonment. Irrigation systems are built and then left unused. These shifts align not with sudden invasions, but with climatic disruptions that would have made survival increasingly difficult. The ocean did not attack, it simply changed. Across the Indian Ocean, similar patterns emerge. Monsoon-dependent civilizations relied on the regular movement of warm and cool waters to sustain predictable winds and rainfall. When those systems destabilized, harvests failed, and trade routes collapsed. What had once been an interconnected maritime world fragmented into isolated regions struggling to adapt. These disruptions were not constant. They came and went. That is what made them dangerous. A civilization can adapt to a harsh environment if it is consistently harsh. It can build culture and technology around scarcity. What is far more difficult is adapting to instability, when abundance and collapse alternate without warning. El Niño and its counterpart La Niña do not simply create bad years. They undermine expectations. Myths from coastal cultures often speak of the sea as a conscious force, not because people believed it had intent, but because its behavior followed cycles that felt purposeful. Years of generosity were followed by years of punishment. The pattern repeated often enough to be noticed, but not often enough to be easily predicted without long records. Some societies appear to have kept those records. Oral traditions describe years when the ocean turned warm and dead, when fish floated to the surface, when rains drowned villages far from shore while deserts cracked elsewhere. These are not metaphors. They are descriptions filtered through memory. The danger of ocean cycles is not their intensity, but their reach. A change that begins in the Pacific can alter rainfall in Africa, trigger droughts in Australia, and shift storm tracks across North America. For a globalized world, this interconnectedness is obvious. For ancient societies, it would have felt like distant causes producing local devastation. What happens when a civilization understands that the sea operates in cycles but cannot influence them? It plans where it can. It diversifies food sources. It builds storage. It develops trade. But when multiple bad years arrive in succession, even the best preparation begins to fail. Archaeology shows this again and again. Infrastructure grows more complex just before collapse. Granaries expand. Canals multiply. Defensive walls rise. These are signs of adaptation, not decadence. They suggest societies responding to increasing stress, not ignoring it. Eventually the ocean shifts back. Fish return. Rains normalize. But the society that endured the disruption may no longer be the same. Population losses break continuity. Knowledge holders disappear. Systems designed for a larger population become unsustainable. The cycle resets not only the environment, but the social structure built upon it. This is how the ocean remembers. Not through permanence, but through recurrence. Each cycle erases some information and leaves behind fragments that future generations struggle to interpret. Over time, the connection between cause and effect fades. The sea becomes unpredictable again, not because it has changed, but because the memory of its patterns has been lost. When modern science identifies El Niño, it does not discover something new. It names something ancient. It gives language to a rhythm that has been shaping human survival since the first boats hugged coastlines and the first nets were cast into shifting waters. If lost civilizations were guided by Earth cycles, then the ocean was one of the most unforgiving teachers. It rewarded attention and punished complacency. It offered abundance, but demanded respect. And when its rhythms were ignored or forgotten, the consequences arrived quietly, season by season, until collapse felt inevitable. The lesson embedded in these patterns is not that ancient people were helpless. It is that they were engaged in a constant negotiation with forces larger than themselves. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they did not. But the ocean never stopped keeping time, and it still has not. There is a boundary in the sky that cannot be seen from the ground, a moving wall that circles the planet and quietly decides who will feel the bite of winter and who will be spared. It is not made of stone or ice, and yet its presence has shaped history as surely as any mountain range or ocean current. When this wall holds, civilizations flourish. When it falters, the cold comes south, and with it, collapse. Modern science calls this system the jet streams and the polar vortex, fast-moving rivers of air that separate frozen polar regions from the more temperate zones below. Under stable conditions, these winds form a kind of atmospheric barrier, keeping the deepest cold locked near the poles. Most of the time, people live their entire lives unaware that this boundary exists at all. But ancient societies may have known it in a different way. Across the northern world, there are recurring legends of sudden winters, of years when cold arrived without warning and refused to leave, of lands once green that became uninhabitable within a generation. These stories do not describe gradual cooling. They describe intrusion, a force that crossed an invisible line and overwhelmed everything in its path. In later myth, this became the language of gods and monsters, of frozen realms breaking free, of walls breached and chaos spilling south. Yet beneath the symbolism lies a consistent observation. Winter does not always behave as expected. Sometimes it escapes its bounds. When the jet streams weaken or begin to wander, Arctic air can surge far beyond its usual domain. Regions adapted to seasonal cold suddenly face prolonged freezes. Crops fail, livestock dies, rivers freeze in unfamiliar ways, trade routes collapse. A society that has no memory of such events has little chance to prepare for them. In the archaeological record, abrupt cooling events appear like scars. Tree rings narrow suddenly. Pollen records show rapid shifts in vegetation. Settlements contract or are abandoned altogether. These changes often occur without evidence of invasion or internal collapse. The land itself becomes hostile. One of the most striking examples occurred during the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near-glacial conditions after the planet had already begun to warm. For more than 1,000 years, temperatures dropped sharply across the northern hemisphere. Ice advanced. Rainfall patterns shifted. Regions that had supported growing populations became marginal almost overnight. To people living through it, this would not have felt like a slow climate trend. It would have felt like betrayal, a return of winter when spring had already begun. If earlier civilizations existed during or shortly after such events, their memory of sudden cold would have carried enormous weight. The idea that winter was something that could break free would not be metaphorical. It would be historical experience. This may explain why northern myths often speak of a lost golden age followed by an age of ice, of worlds separated by catastrophe rather than continuity. These are not abstract cosmologies. They are attempts to describe atmospheric behavior that does not fit everyday expectations. When the winds shift, they do not ask permission. Jet streams respond to temperature gradients across the planet. When those gradients change, whether through natural cycles or cascading effects from oceans and ice, the winds adjust, sometimes smoothly, sometimes violently. When they overcorrect, they begin to meander, looping far north and south instead of maintaining a stable path. For civilizations built on predictability, this is devastating. A single extreme winter can be survived. Repeated abnormal winters break systems. Storage runs out. Infrastructure fails. Social order frays. What makes this particularly dangerous is that once conditions return to normal, there is a tendency to forget. Memory shortens. The event is recorded as an anomaly rather than a pattern. Preparation fades. The wall of wind holds again, and life resumes as though nothing fundamental has changed. But the boundary remains dynamic. In myth, the idea of a northern force held back by an unseen barrier appears again and again. Whether described as a wall, a ring, or a cosmic boundary, the theme is consistent. There is something that keeps the cold contained, and if it fails, the world changes. This is not mystical thinking. It is experiential knowledge translated into story. If ancient civilizations were guided by Earth's cycles, then understanding the behavior of the winds would have been critical. Not in the language of pressure gradients and Coriolis forces, but through lived patterns. Certain alignments of seasons. Certain years when preparation needed to be greater. Certain signs that winter would not behave normally. Yet like all long memory, this knowledge was fragile. A few generations of stable climate are enough to erode urgency. Skills are lost. Stories soften. What was once a warning becomes legend. When the winds shift again, the response is delayed, and the consequences multiply. Civilizations rarely collapse in a single dramatic moment. More often, they are worn down by repeated stress until they can no longer recover. A wandering wall of wind does not destroy cities directly. It undermines the conditions that allow them to exist. The cold does not conquer, it exhausts. And when it retreats once more, it leaves behind empty spaces where societies once stood, inviting future cultures to settle without understanding why those places were abandoned in the first place. The wall holds until it does not. Beneath every civilization, beneath every mountain range and ocean basin, there is a movement that no one can see, and yet no one escapes. It is slow, chaotic, and immensely powerful. Deep within the earth, molten iron flows in vast looping currents, and from that restless motion emerges an invisible shield that has protected life for hundreds of millions of years. Most of the time it is taken for granted. When it weakens, the consequences reach everywhere. The Earth's magnetic field is not a static feature. It is not a permanent barrier switched on at the birth of the planet. It is a dynamic system generated by motion and heat, by circulation in the liquid outer core that never truly settles. As long as that motion continues, the field exists. When it destabilizes, the shield falters. Modern measurements reveal just how unstable this system can be. The magnetic poles do not sit quietly at the top and bottom of the planet. They drift. Over the past century, the North Magnetic Pole has accelerated its movement dramatically, migrating hundreds of kilometers across the Arctic towards Siberia at a pace far faster than previously recorded. This is not a reversal, but it is a signal that the field is reorganizing itself in ways that are neither smooth nor predictable. At the same time, the strength of the field is not evenly distributed. One region in particular has drawn increasing attention. Over the South Atlantic, stretching from South America towards southern Africa, the magnetic field has thinned into a broad zone of weakness now known as the South Atlantic anomaly. Here the protective shield dips closer to the surface, allowing higher levels of radiation to penetrate the upper atmosphere. In the modern world, this anomaly is not theoretical. Satellites passing through it experience increased errors, electronic disruptions, and accelerated degradation. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station report heightened radiation exposure when crossing the region. These effects are small but measurable, reminders that the shield is not uniform and not permanent. Over long stretches of time, such weaknesses can deepen. In the geological record, periods of geomagnetic instability are marked by excursions, intervals when the field weakens to a fraction of its usual strength without fully reversing. During these times, the poles may wander far from their usual positions before eventually returning. To contemporary observers, these events are framed as distant risks unfolding over thousands of years. To ancient societies, the experience would have been immediate and visceral. When the magnetic field weakens, more charged particles from the sun and from deep space penetrate the upper atmosphere. Auroras spread far beyond their usual polar confines, lighting skies at latitudes where they had never been seen before. The night sky glows, flickers, and moves in unfamiliar ways. To people whose cosmology linked the heavens to earthly fate, such displays would not have been dismissed as harmless beauty. They would have been interpreted as signs that the order of the world was shifting. There is evidence that these periods coincided with environmental stress. Ice cores and sediment records show spikes in cosmogenic isotopes, signatures left behind when increased radiation reaches the planet during times of magnetic instability. Climate patterns appear to have shifted. In some regions, ecosystems collapsed rapidly, while in others they remained relatively stable. The effects were uneven, localized, and unpredictable, which made them all the more difficult to adapt to. From the perspective of human survival, uneven stress is often worse than uniform hardship. When neighboring regions experience different conditions, trade breaks down, migration increases, competition intensifies. Societies fracture under pressure not because everyone is starving, but because some are starving while others are not. Ancient myths occasionally describe eras when the sky burned or when the sun behaved strangely. These accounts are often dismissed as metaphor, yet in the context of a weakening magnetic field, they take on another dimension. A sky filled with widespread auroral activity would have appeared alive, volatile, and dangerous. It would have reinforced the sense that protection had been lost. The magnetic field does more than shape the sky. It also shields the atmosphere itself. Over long periods, a weakened field allows solar winds to erode upper layers of atmospheric gases. This process is slow, unfolding over centuries, but it contributes to climatic instability by altering how heat is retained and distributed. For civilizations already operating near the limits of environmental tolerance, even subtle changes could cascade into larger failures. What makes geomagnetic events particularly insidious is their subtlety. They do not arrive as singular catastrophes. They unfold gradually, blending into the background of other changes. One generation notices brighter skies. The next notices altered weather. The next notices declining harvests. By the time collapse becomes undeniable, the original cause has faded from memory. If ancient civilizations once tracked Earth's cycles, this would have been among the most difficult to understand and the easiest to mythologize. The core of the planet was inaccessible. The field itself was invisible. Only its effects could be observed indirectly through the behavior of the heavens. Knowledge of such a cycle, even in partial form, would have carried immense weight. It would have suggested that protection itself was temporary, that the planet periodically exposed its surface to forces from space. It would have reinforced the idea that civilization existed not under permanent guardianship, but under a conditional one. Yet knowledge of danger does not guarantee resilience. A society might remember that the shield weakens from time to time without being able to act meaningfully on that information. Stone walls do not block radiation. Rituals do not restore magnetic fields. Preparation can mitigate some consequences, but others remain beyond control. This is where memory becomes a burden rather than a tool. To know that collapse has happened before, to know that the sky itself can turn hostile, is not the same as knowing how to prevent it. Over time, such knowledge may be softened, reframed, or buried beneath more comforting narratives. When stability returns, when auroras retreat and conditions normalize, the urgency fades. The shield feels permanent again. The cycle recedes into myth. But the Earth does not forget. Its core continues to churn. Its field continues to wander. And with each oscillation, it reminds us that protection is not guaranteed, only renewed for a time. If lost civilizations were guided by Earth's cycles, then moments when the planet lost its shield may have marked the boundaries between worlds. Not with fire or flood alone, but with a quieter realization that the rules had changed and that survival required adaptation beyond what was possible. The collapse that follows such periods is rarely sudden. It is attritional, a slow unraveling driven by forces no one can see but everyone feels. The shield returns. Civilization rises again, and the memory of vulnerability fades, waiting for the next time the Earth decides to remind its inhabitants how thin that protection truly is. Of all the forces that shape life on Earth, none feels as constant or as dependable as the sun. It rises every morning, it sets every evening, crops grow under its light, seasons follow its path across the sky. For most of human history, it appeared eternal, unchanging, a steady presence around which all other rhythms revolved. But the sun is not a fixed beacon. It pulses. Hidden beneath its blinding brightness is a cycle of activity that waxes and wanes over roughly 11 years, a rhythm driven by the twisting and reorganization of immense magnetic fields inside a star so vast that it could swallow the Earth more than 1,000,000 times over. During its quiet phase, the sun appears calm. During its active phase, it becomes volatile, releasing flares and occasionally hurling vast clouds of magnetized plasma outward into space in events known as coronal mass ejections. These coronal mass ejections, or CMEs, are not bursts of light, but massive expulsions of charged matter, carrying billions of tons of solar material across the solar system at extreme speeds. When one of these eruptions is directed toward Earth, it collides with the planet's magnetic field, compressing it, shaking it, and forcing energy deep into the upper atmosphere. Modern instruments can track these events precisely. Ancient civilizations could not, yet they still lived with their consequences. Periods of heightened solar activity bring subtle but widespread effects to Earth. Radiation levels increase in the upper atmosphere. Electrical currents are induced in the ground. Atmospheric chemistry shifts. In extreme cases, powerful CMEs can disrupt the very systems that regulate climate patterns, nudging weather behavior away from its expected norms. To a society dependent on stable seasons, even small deviations could have outsized consequences. Planting too early or too late could mean famine. Livestock could suffer from unexpected heat or cold. Water supplies could fluctuate in ways that undermined entire regions. These failures would not appear to originate from the sun, yet the timing would not go unnoticed. What makes solar cycles particularly dangerous is not their magnitude, but their timing. They overlay other Earth cycles rather than replacing them. When heightened solar activity coincides with climatic stress driven by oceans, winds, or long orbital rhythms, the combined effect can push fragile systems past their breaking point. Solar maximums also increase the probability of extreme space weather events. A powerful CME striking a planet whose magnetic field is already weakened can amplify radiation exposure and atmospheric disruption. In the modern world, this raises fears about satellites, navigation systems, and power grids. In ancient worlds, the effects would have been experienced indirectly through failed harvests, altered animal behavior, disrupted navigation, and sudden environmental instability. Ancient cultures across the world elevated the sun to a central place in their cosmology, not simply as a giver of life, but as a regulator of order. Solar deities were often associated with judgment, renewal, and destruction as much as with growth. This duality reflects lived experience. The sun sustained life, but it also marked periods of danger. In some traditions, cycles of prosperity and collapse were linked to ages ruled by different solar aspects. These were not predictions in the modern sense. They were frameworks for understanding why the world sometimes seemed to turn against those who depended on it, even when human behavior had not obviously changed. There is growing evidence that solar cycles influence biological systems. Variations in radiation affect mutation rates slightly, alter atmospheric chemistry, and influence animal behavior. Migratory patterns shift, breeding seasons adjust. In a tightly coupled ecological network, these small changes ripple outward, sometimes destabilizing entire systems. For early civilizations, these ripples would have been interpreted as omens, not because they lacked rationality, but because they lacked a separate category for phenomena that crossed the boundary between sky and life. When harvests failed and disease spread during periods of unusual solar activity, the connection would have felt direct and immediate. What is striking is how often major periods of social upheaval coincide, not with single disasters, but with clusters of environmental stressors. Collapse is rarely triggered by one event alone. It is triggered by convergence. The sun plays a critical role in these convergences. It is the external driver that can amplify internal instability. When solar activity intensifies at the wrong moment, it does not need to destroy infrastructure directly. It only needs to push already strained systems beyond their limits. This may help explain why some civilizations appeared to reset rather than simply decline. Archaeological layers show periods of abandonment followed by reoccupation. Cultural continuity breaks, then resumes in altered form. Knowledge is lost, then rediscovered. The sun did not end these societies by itself. It synchronized with other forces that did. Over time, such experiences shaped collective memory. The sun came to represent both continuity and renewal, a symbol of cycles larger than human ambition. Worship was not submission, it was acknowledgement. If Earth's cycles once guided lost civilizations, then solar rhythms would have been among the most difficult to anticipate and the hardest to resist. They were predictable only in hindsight. Their impacts were diffuse rather than dramatic. They tested resilience rather than strength. In the modern world, we often speak of resilience as a technical problem. In the ancient world, it was a philosophical one. How do you build a society around a force that gives life, yet periodically destabilizes the conditions that society depends upon? The answer, again and again, was to encode memory into culture, to remind each generation that prosperity was conditional, that renewal followed disruption, that collapse was not failure but transition. The sun rises after every dark age, but it does not guarantee what kind of world it will illuminate. If the sun governed the long breath of life, then the moon ruled its pulse. It moved closer, farther, brighter, darker, drawing the oceans into motion with a force that was gentle in appearance but absolute in effect. No civilization that lived near water could ignore it. The tides arrived whether they were expected or not, reshaping coastlines twice each day, reminding humanity that even solid ground was negotiable. To ancient observers, the moon was not mysterious because it was unpredictable. It was mysterious because it was precise. Its phases returned with unwavering regularity. Its influence could be tested and confirmed. Fish appeared in certain patterns. Shorelines exposed themselves and then disappeared. Boats moved more easily at some times than others. Over generations, these observations accumulated into knowledge that was practical rather than poetic. But beneath the familiar rhythm of daily tides, there was a deeper motion, one that unfolded slowly enough to escape immediate notice. Roughly every 18.5 years, the orientation of the moon's orbit slowly shifts, altering how its gravitational pull aligns with the Earth and the Sun. This subtle realignment changes the balance that governs tidal extremes. When the cycle reaches its peak, high tides rise higher than usual and low tides fall lower. On their own, these changes are manageable. Combined with storms and elevated sea levels, they become destructive. Modern science refers to this long rhythm as the lunar nodal cycle. Ancient societies did not name it, but they lived inside it. Coastal settlements across the world reveal a pattern of repeated disruption that aligns with this hidden pulse. Harbours slowly silted up. Salt water intruded into farmland. Low-lying structures were rebuilt again and again or abandoned altogether. In some regions, entire communities retreated inland, only to return generations later when conditions stabilized. These movements were not random. They followed the rhythm of the water, even when the people experiencing them did not consciously recognize the cycle behind it. Flood stories appear with striking consistency across the ancient world. A great inundation, a warning ignored, a remnant saved. These stories are often treated as moral allegories, but they align closely with periods when rising seas and amplified tidal extremes would have combined to overwhelm early coastal societies. The moon does not flood the world in a single moment. It increases the probability of flooding at regular intervals, quietly stacking the odds. What makes lunar-driven flooding especially dangerous is its predictability without immediacy. A civilization may experience a catastrophic flood once or twice within living memory. By the time the next extreme arrives, the knowledge of the previous one may exist only as story, stripped of urgency and practical detail. Preparation fades. Vulnerable areas are resettled. The same mistakes are repeated. The moon's influence does not act alone. As ice ages end and global temperatures rise, sea levels climb, shifting the baseline upward. Floods that were once rare become frequent. High tides reach farther inland. Storm surges ride on top of already elevated waters. The lunar cycle itself does not change, but its impact intensifies as background conditions evolve. Ancient engineering sometimes reflects an awareness of this danger. raised platforms, artificial mounds, cities designed with elevated ceremonial centers and lower peripheral zones. These were not purely symbolic choices, they were adaptations to a world where water could claim territory without warning. Yet adaptation has limits. As populations grow, pressure to occupy fertile coastal land increases. Trade concentrates wealth and power near ports. Political centers gravitate toward the sea. Over time, risk is normalized. Flooding becomes an inconvenience rather than a warning. When the next extreme arrives, it is no longer survivable. In myth, this becomes a story of hubris. In reality, it is a story of forgetting. If Earth's cycles once guided civilizations, the moon would have been one of the clearest teachers. It demonstrated that stability was conditional and that boundaries shifted over time. It taught that the line between land and sea was not fixed, only temporarily agreed upon. The collapse that follows rising waters is rarely dramatic in the way stories suggest. It is incremental. Infrastructure degrades. Disease spreads in stagnant water. Agriculture fails as soils turn saline. Economies contract. People leave. What remains is interpreted later as abandonment rather than retreat. Centuries pass. Waters recede. The land becomes habitable again. New settlers arrive with no memory of why the old ones left. Ruins are reused. Myths are retold without context. The cycle completes itself. Today, scientists recognize that the same lunar cycle continues and that its next peak aligns with a period when global sea levels are already elevated. Projections suggest that during the middle of the 2030s, tidal extremes and flood risk are likely to increase in many coastal regions, not because the moon has changed, but because the world beneath it has. The moon continues its quiet revolution, indifferent to who builds and who abandons. If there is a warning embedded in these patterns, it is not that flooding will destroy civilization outright. It is that civilizations repeatedly choose to believe that the last flood was the last one that mattered. The moon has never made that promise. By the time a civilization realizes it is in trouble, the forces acting upon it have usually been at work for generations. Collapse rarely arrives as a single moment that can be pointed to and named. It unfolds as a slow compression of options, a narrowing of futures, until what once felt like choice becomes necessity, and what once felt permanent becomes fragile. This is the paradox that sits at the center of forgotten worlds. If ancient civilizations truly understood Earth's cycles, even partially, then why did they still fall? Why did knowledge not save them? The answer lies in the nature of the cycles themselves. None of the rhythms that govern the planet operate alone. Orbital changes overlap with ocean pulses. Atmospheric boundaries shift while solar activity rises. Sea levels climb as tidal extremes intensify. Magnetic fields weaken during periods of climatic stress. Each cycle on its own may be survivable. Together they compound. A society might recognize a flood cycle and prepare for water. It might recognize colder winters and store grain. It might recognize drought and build irrigation. But when multiple stresses arrive at once, the systems designed to manage them begin to interfere with one another. Resources are diverted. Priorities conflict. Decisions that solve one problem worsen another. This is when knowledge begins to fracture. Record-keeping fails first. Archives are neglected or destroyed during migration and conflict. Specialists disappear. Oral traditions lose precision as trauma compresses memory into symbolism. What was once practical guidance becomes mythic reference. What was once exact timing becomes a general warning that something bad happened long ago. Archaeology preserves this moment imperfectly. Layers show sudden declines in population. Construction halts mid-project. Tools remain where they were last used. In some regions, technological sophistication regresses. In others, it vanishes entirely. These are not signs of ignorance, they are signs of interruption. When systems collapse, they do not take all knowledge with them. They take continuity. A child born after collapse inherits fragments without context, a calendar without climate, a myth without measurement, an alignment without explanation. The cycle continues to move, but the interface that once connected human action to planetary rhythm is broken. This may explain why so many ancient sites feel simultaneously advanced and incomplete. They look like the remnants of something that understood more than it could preserve. Precision without instruction, complexity without explanation. We see the result, but not the reasoning. The reset that follows is not a return to zero. It is a reorganization around what remains. New societies emerge using whatever fragments survived the disruption. They adapt to the new conditions rather than the old ones. They build stories that make sense of the ruins around them. Over time, those stories become origin myths rather than warnings. From within the new world, the collapse of the old one appears total. From the perspective of deep time, it is transitional. What is lost in this process is not only infrastructure or population, but perspective. The memory that Earth operates on scales larger than civilization fades. The urgency that once drove careful observation dissolves. Stability is assumed again because it is all that has been experienced. This is the most dangerous phase of the cycle. A civilization that knows it is temporary behaves differently from one that believes it is permanent. The first plans for disruption, the second plans for expansion. Over time, expansion increases vulnerability. Systems become optimized rather than resilient. Margins shrink. Redundancy is removed. When the next convergence of cycles arrives, the response is slower and less coordinated than before. Knowledge exists, but it is fragmented across institutions that no longer communicate. Warnings are debated rather than acted upon. Preparation is postponed because consequences feel abstract. This is how knowledge fails, not because it was wrong, but because it arrived without authority. In ancient worlds, authority came from memory, from the weight of experience passed down through generations. When that chain was broken, expertise lost its power. Decisions were made without reference to long cycles, because long cycles were no longer part of lived reality. The reset completes itself when enough time passes that the collapse is no longer remembered as collapse. It becomes prehistory. Ruins are attributed to legend. Discontinuities are smoothed over. Humanity tells itself a new beginning has occurred. But the Earth does not recognize beginnings. Its cycles continue uninterrupted, indifferent to which societies understand them and which do not. Each reset clears the surface, while leaving the deeper rhythms untouched. If lost civilizations were guided by Earth's cycles, then their failure does not disprove the value of that knowledge. It demonstrates its fragility. Understanding must be maintained continuously, or it degrades. Memory must be renewed, or it fades. Awareness must be lived, or it becomes symbolic. The reset is not punishment. It is consequence, and it is not finished. There is a temptation at the end of every long story to believe that it has been leading toward us all along, that the present moment is the culmination rather than another passage. Modern civilization is especially vulnerable to this illusion. We measure progress in decades, innovation in years, and success in quarters. Against that scale, the Earth appears slow, passive, and forgiving. But when viewed through the lens of deep time, our moment looks less like an ending and more like a familiar phase. We now understand more about Earth's cycles than any civilization before us. We can measure the wobble of the planet's axis to fractions of a degree. We can track ocean temperatures across the entire globe in real time. We can observe solar storms as they erupt and calculate their arrival at Earth days in advance. We can detect changes in the magnetic field unfolding deep beneath our feet, and yet knowledge alone has never been the deciding factor. The civilizations that came before us were not ignorant of change. They experienced it directly. They built cultures around it. They encoded it into stone and story. Their failure was not that they misunderstood the planet, but that they could not outlast the convergence of forces acting upon them. The uncomfortable parallel is this: we recognize the cycles, but we no longer organize our lives around them. Our systems assume continuity. Our infrastructure assumes stability. Our economies assume growth. When cycles are acknowledged, they are often treated as background variables rather than governing forces. We debate them, we model them, we argue over responsibility, but we rarely restructure society to accommodate them. The result is a familiar pattern. Rising seas meet coastal megacities. Shifting atmospheric currents collide with globalized agriculture. Solar activity intersects with a civilization dependent on fragile technological networks. Magnetic weakening coincides with unprecedented reliance on satellites and electricity. Each issue is discussed in isolation, while the deeper convergence remains largely unaddressed. This is not because the information is unavailable. It is because acting on long cycles requires decisions that are uncomfortable in the short term. It requires restraint rather than expansion, preparation rather than optimization, memory rather than confidence. Ancient civilizations often collapse not at the first sign of change, but after prolonged periods of denial. Conditions worsened slowly enough to be rationalized. Adaptations were delayed. Warnings were reframed as exaggerations. By the time decisive action became unavoidable, options had narrowed. We recognize this pattern because we are living inside it. Climate change today is often framed as a single phenomenon, but it is better understood as an amplifier. It accelerates processes that already exist. It sharpens extremes that were once rare. It compresses timelines that once unfolded over centuries into decades. In this sense, humanity has become a new variable in Earth's cycles, not replacing them, but interacting with them in unpredictable ways. The planet's rhythms did not stop when industry began. They continued. What changed was the speed at which pressures accumulated. This places modern civilization in a position unlike any before it. We are aware of the cycles and aware of our influence, yet still constrained by systems designed for a more stable world. We are both informed and unprepared. The forgotten worlds of the past offer no simple warning and no guaranteed lesson. They show us that understanding does not equal control, and that survival depends as much on humility as on knowledge. They remind us that civilizations rise during favorable alignments and struggle when those alignments dissolve. The question is not whether Earth's cycles will continue. They will. The question is whether we will continue to treat the current moment as permanent or recognize it as transitional. Whether we will act as participants in a larger system or as its final authority. Whether we will preserve memory in forms that can endure disruption or allow it to fragment once again. If ancient civilizations once guided themselves by Earth's cycles, then their collapse was not the result of superstition. It was the result of limits. Limits of coordination. Limits of scale. Limits of time. We have extended those limits, but we have not escaped them. History suggests that the most dangerous belief a civilization can hold is that it has moved beyond history itself, that the rules no longer apply, that the cycles have been mastered rather than merely observed. The Earth has never made that promise. It has only offered windows of stability between phases of change, windows long enough for societies to flourish and short enough to remind them that flourishing is conditional. Whether we are approaching the edge of such a window or simply standing within it remains uncertain. What is clear is that the cycles are still turning, quietly and relentlessly, as they always have. And long after our debates fade and our structures erode, the planet will continue to move through its rhythms, carrying forward the memory of every world that rose, believing it was the exception. If this story resonated with you, even quietly, you can support this channel in simple ways. A like helps the story travel a little further. Sharing it passes the question on to someone else. And if you choose to subscribe, you'll be here when the next forgotten world is explored. Thank you for listening and for taking this journey with us. The only question left is whether we will become another forgotten world, or whether remembering the cycles this time will finally change the ending.